Okay. Let's start, if I may, with this. And then I mentioned this in our first meeting, and I know you had said you would get me an email, and
Yeah, I
you
haven't
haven't
done
received it yet. But if you got it on your phone, or then you can write it in here.
Okay.
If categorically got a plan, it's all set in stone. I'm not going to be here on a Sunday. Let me know if you know. If I'm uncertain, don't put anything down. Let's just wait until we're certain. Like HD emailed me earlier, and he was like, not sure about this. Maybe. I said, hey, let me know when it's certain. I don't want to speculate, and I don't want to go to a lot of angst trying to figure something out if it doesn't materialize.
Yeah.
And if we have to go to the last minute, and you call me on Saturday night and say, hey, I'm going to be there, we'll just adjust like we did with other classes. When it happens, we just go with it. We roll with it. It's fine. It's fine. But if put it down. That way it'll help me a little bit in planning, because I do have to find coverage. With respect to this lesson, again, I think having looked at it, and if you think back to last week's lesson, the introductory statements here do a good job of kind of like looking back and say, okay, last week we kind of discussed Paul's apostleship. He was divinely appointed, and therefore he was authoritative. This week, we're going to discuss his message. Pastor, by design, flip-flopped the passages, chapter 1, and dealt with his apostleship before he dealt with the gospel itself, his message. So I think it's important that you establish that right off the bat. To what end, to what extent, how far you want to go reviewing anything from last week is entirely up to you by way of setting the table. If you look at the objectives at the top of the first page, as near as I could tell going through this, and I'm trying to do this each time we look at a lesson, match these objectives up to the content of the lesson. And the first three objectives there listed really do align themselves with the three major points that he has listed here. The first objective aligns with the gospel defined, the second one with the gospel defiled, and the third one with the gospel defended. So this thing kind of teaches itself. If you don't have to do a lot to, in a sense of coming up with something really out there. It really is an expositional treatment of the passage, verses basically 2 through 9 of chapter 1. So think of it in terms of I'm not going to talk about it in topical sense. I'm really going to do an expositional presentation of this passage. Okay, I'm just going to, and I would even made a note to myself, if I were teaching it, I would say after I introduce this, let's look at it, let's read it together, or have a volunteer to read, or whatever. So it kind of sets the table for, all right, we're going to break this down into 3 subpoints, okay? But again, how you choose to get into that, it's entirely up to you. I wrote the question in for myself, and I'm surprised after I saw it, I didn't go to the pastor and say, here's what you need to put in the introduction. What is the gospel? Let me ask you, what's the gospel? Before we read this passage and look at, he says how the gospel is defined, I would almost venture to say that it's more of an explanation than a definition. But that being said, we're defining what is the gospel here, okay? And that would be a great discussion question, kind of just get the ball rolling. However you wanted to posture it, whether large group, small group, however, the point is, give me what you know about the gospel. And I dare say that most of what you will hear is not going to be wrong, but it won't necessarily align with what's right here in this passage as he has laid it out. But that's fine. They may touch on some of the thoughts here, but they may cover quite a few more. The point is, and that's the whole point of this message, is that we need to know what the gospel is so that we can defend it properly, okay? We can't be diverted ourselves, even in this day and time. That's one of the interesting discussion questions somewhere in here. He talks about, false teachers and the false gospel. And we think that was, this was then. Well, it's been true in all ages. Time immemorial, there's been a false gospel out there. There are people that have diluted the gospel and added things and taken away things. So I think the point of the message is we need to know what the gospel is so that we can present it properly. So having a discussion around what is the gospel, just to start, just an idea, But if you want to engage people and engage them early, to me, that would be a way to do it. Now, if you were to read the passage first and then ask the question, then I might ask the question, according to this passage, then, what is the gospel? Dig in a little bit. Let's look specifically at these. What does it say in there? So I'm driving them to the passage that we're going to discuss. But I've read it. Now I'm asking the question. I'm saying according to this passage. So I'm narrowing their focus and not allowing them to go hither and yon. So you can do it either way. You can say, let's talk about what it is and let them go anywhere. And then say, okay, let's look at this passage and let's see what Paul writes, especially in these first couple of verses. What does he say here? So there's just a couple of ideas that I have relative to how you could get started with this, especially this first point. But there's some good points there. I'm trying to think. I don't think I can add anything to or expound any more on what he has already written. I was noticing the second point a little bit more. I think the whole idea that the idea of the present evil age. Again, it's not something that was just unique to that time. We deal with it as well. The fourth objective I should note before I get away from it, applying lessons. He's written, and I'm really excited that he's doing this and he's seeing it, and he's got some great discussion questions. And I say this again because I said it the first time we met. You're not obligated to use any of these, okay? I would also say that I wouldn't try to use all of them, because if you did, you might never get to the end of the lesson, because you could take any one of these and have some really good discussion, because I think there's some really, really good questions here. But the point of the questions, many of the questions, is application. So what does that mean to us? Okay, talking about the present evil age. What does that mean? He was talking about it in the context of his time. What does that mean for us today? Talking about every false gospel is a direct attack on the person and work of Christ. Why? Why is that relevant to us today? Because Christ is under attack today. So, we can look through any one of these questions and find relevancy. And so I would encourage you and challenge you to please think about at least having two good discussions, whatever they are, to drive home the point, either A, of we need to know the true gospel, or B, we need to be aware that there is a false gospel out there that we need to be careful to avoid. Under the gospel defiled, I think the one thing that I noted there was this idea of the change in mood from verses 5 to verse 6. And the key words are at the top of the third page there. He talks about, in the ESV, it's the word deserting. In the KJV, it's removed. And it's the idea of spiritual mutiny, and the word has its derivations in the military context, traitors, turncoats. So you're painting a picture here of the origin of this thought. And what he's accusing them of is, you're traitors, you're turncoats, okay? And the other thought is that it's in the present tense, so it wasn't that they had already turned, but they were turning, they were being influenced. And then as he gets down here, he talks about the Judaizers had preached a false, and the word in the ESV is distort, and the word in KJV is pervert. And it's interesting that as I'm looking these up, these are the same, the root word here for these two words is the same root word for deserting and removed. It's kind of like they're in the same family, okay? So this whole thing, so you've got these people who are basically causing you to desert, okay, by distorting the message. And so again, we need to be careful ourselves. He points out in this one discussion questions, false teachers, every single New Testament book, with the exception of Philemon, deals with false teachers. So every writer, not just Paul, but every other writer writing in the New Testament, wow, that must be a serious problem.
Well, Christ himself even warns.
There you go. There you go. So, so the question is, how should that affect us today? What does that say to us? Okay. And in the next discussion question on the next page, he talks about the dangers of following blindly men. And boy, as I think back over my 65 years of all the big names in Christian circles, especially in fundamental circles, and how they've had a following, and how when they passed or they were no longer prominent, how quickly their movement died because it was built around them, around their personality, as opposed to their doctrine. Okay, so I think that's another great point to make. So
Well, that's
again,
even true for the occult and people who follow these leaders of these. It's just amazing. Like, why would they?
personalities come and go, and we are attracted to personalities as opposed to the content. I can remember my mother, they hear something, they hear quote unquote what they think is the gospel because they hear the name Jesus Christ or Christ saves or some catchphrase. And right away we think, okay, their message is good. It's solid. And you stop and say, okay, but let's look at the total message.
Right.
Mormons will talk to you.
I know. I'm always amazed on how the Mormonism even got traction because it's just so far out in left field as far as their.
I think their biggest draw is that they are tight. They take care of people. They really are a caring,
right.
caring.
But they don't know the gospel.
Well, they have their version of it, but they use all the same buzzwords we use.
Exactly. They did.
Yeah, like I was telling the class on Sunday, like whenever you're overseas, for an extended period of time, Greg's colleagues that were there, one was Mormon, one was Jew. So the three of us were spent 2 months together, and the Mormon was constantly trying to override me on tipping and everything else. Like, how much did you tip? Because I'm going to tip, but he was constantly talking about faith. She would talk a lot about faith and doing good. I mean, similar language was kind of woven in there. I mean, she didn't talk about the fact that they do a lot of weird things with other things. But then one day we're sitting at lunch and one of them, I can't even remember who, brought up the book of Left Behind. Have you read Left Behind? Oh, I think it was the Jewish woman said, have you read the book Left Behind? And I'm like, okay, what? And before I could answer, the Mormon said, what is that? And then the Jewish lady said, well, it's about the book when Jesus Christ comes back at the second coming and the rapture, the rapture takes place. And I'm just sitting there listening to the Jewish woman who had a Pentecostal friend share with the Mormon about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so everybody could, we're just all having a good talk about Jesus and the rapture and faith and goodness. And each went their own way thinking they were a lot, aligned with, I don't know. It's just, I was even sharing with the classes last week, this Jewish instructor, I can't think of her name. I'll have to pull it back up. But she teaches at a Christian school. She's Jewish, and Judaism is her. I mean, she's not a believer, a Christian believer, but she teaches theology just to give historical theology at a Christian school. So she said, oh, it's so ironic because, this is actually what Paul did to the, so she's setting the base, but her whole thing was presenting this new Paul, which is more palatable to modern day people, and trying to explain to them that Paul never really was a Christian. He was still a Judaizer, but he made a gateway for the Gentiles, and that allowed him to then get them kind of a pass through, but he still maintained his Judaism. He still is considered kind of brash and an outcast by them because of what he said and all his, but it's just, the whole thing was so interesting to me that even this many years later, their perception of Paul's personality and the faith, and it really set it up as a monotheism. She said, it was never one religion better than the other. They both could coexist, and all roads lead to Rome almost. So it was really, I mean, she has an audio YouTube thing that I almost played, but it was a really interesting article to see her points of breaking down who Paul was and what he actually was in the gospel versus Judaism. I mean, it was not Christ-centered. He still was God-centered, but he wasn't Christ-centered. So.
Well, I think again, we made the very strong point that Paul was called of God, chosen by God, set apart by God for the reasons of last week. Now now that we defended who he was, now we defend his message this week. I think to me, it really lays itself out well to really discuss what is the gospel, because that's what Paul is fighting for here. And we need to know what we believe in that respect, and we need to know how to defend it, but defend it properly, and that there are false teachers. I think those are the two, to me at least, key messages out there. There is a danger. We need to be aware of it. We need to be ready to defend, but not in a way that's, offensive, other than the message itself is offensive. I question Pastor's conclusion. He makes the point of the modern church is very much like the Galatian believers. We are gullible. I said, okay, well, what do you mean by the modern church? Are you including all churches? But he wanted it left that way. Okay, so okay, let's look at that and let's ask ourselves, okay, have we lost the will to oppose error? And therefore we've lost even the ability to recognize error. That is a very interesting statement. I wrote beside it, agree or disagree. Do we really know what we believe? Do we really care? Do we really care when there's error? Or do we just dismiss it as, well, that's just the way they think? Or are we prepared to stand up for what we believe? Do we know? Can we recognize it when we hear it? Or are we sucked into it? Okay, that's a great question. How well do we know what we believe? So that we can tell, the whole idea of counterfeit. Do we know the real thing so well that we know the counterfeit when we hear it?
Right.
So to me, another strong lesson with some great questions that you can leverage any way you want, tied into a good solid message last week. And this is chapter 1. This is who I am and this is what I preach. And you need to understand that. And you understand how important it is. Okay. And I think it's where he's trying to set the table for what goes on from here. Your thoughts as you've had a chance to look it over or think about it, or based on anything I've said to this point.
I think I think it feeds into it well. I think it was a springboard last week, and this is the real crux of it. Is not so much, Paul had to set himself up as, credible and legitimate, but the whole purpose is for the defense of the gospel. And like you said, do we know what we believe? Do we know what's truth, so that we can be discerners and not led astray? When it talks in, is it 2 Timothy 4:3, about when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but to suit their own desires. So, basically just look for their own itching ears, that somebody pleases them, a personality or an idea or a concept that works better and softens their gospel or enjoyable or whatever. I think we all, you grow up for years in a church, like in a fundamentalist church even, and then, friends of yours start to pull away into different, other more conservative or more to the left, and you start to hear even the debates and arguments on Facebook, and at some time even you start to think, why do we do this, or why do I follow this, or that's not, and you start to question even on and different topics of things. So I think you have to really know what you believe in. Like my kids, even when I sent them off to college, Hannah, I said, okay, she was going to go to Liberty at that time. And I was like, you're going to have a lot of different chapel speakers in convocation. You're going to hear a lot of different things, and it's under convocation, not chapel, but you're going to hear from a lot of different speakers, and you'll just have to know how to discern. And she was like, Mom, I know my doctrine. I had Robert Sherman. I said, there you go. So, but it was just funny because she felt, the point I was driving, I didn't even say that, but she was like, I know my doctrine. And she goes, we even talk about it in class. We have points that, Mr. Sherman would give us to cipher through, and, is this accurate? But that has just laid the groundwork. And I think we all need to look, do we know doctrine? Do we know?
Both of my children said the same thing about
it was just like, she just looked at me like, what are you thinking? You just sent me through. But it was and she didn't even hesitate. Like, I know my doctrine.
Well, to your point, I think we need to know what we believe. I think many people will not share the gospel. They're fearful of what they might hear and be put on the spot for something that they can't respond to.
Yeah.
A question or whatever. And I think to your point, Paul wasn't shy, but Paul knew the truth, and he stood on the truth. I don't know if there were questions asked of him at this point in his life that he couldn't answer. We don't see that necessarily, but I don't think that he ever shied away from sharing what he knew, what he experienced, his faith, and the gospel as he knew it, and in turn let that stand in and of itself. And I think that's the point that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to know and to share that gospel, and to do so with courage.
Mhm.
There's somewhere near, I think it talks about having the courage of Paul. Maybe it was last week's lesson. But we need to do so with courage. And I'm glad to hear that about the kids. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
That's great
I mean,
stuff.
it is
That they
good.
feel that competent and confident.
Well,
in what they
they
believe.
don't even hesitate, which, I can remember Brad, even he had Robert, and I mean, Robert wouldn't take this as like credit to himself, but credit to the fact of what he shared with them from the gospel. It's not, Robert's gospel himself, but Brad, even earlier, we had been at other churches, and Brad would come back from church, and we're just numb to it. We sat under whatever, and he'd go, what he said wasn't right, or he'd start to say, because this is what and it kind of takes you back a little bit, because I think that the millennials, Steve Pettit would say, the millennials challenge every thought and they ask why. And our generation, we were not allowed to ask why. You didn't ask why. I told you so until you do it. And the millennials question everything. So they go, why? And to see it even in younger, like Brad, he's challenging everything, where I would have sat through it and just been like, oh, I hear it, but I filter some of it out, or I don't pay attention to the subtlety of, even in our fundamental churches, if we're not preaching truth and we're weaving our own in, we can become lulled into what is truth and what's not. But if our kids, hopefully, are discerners, so it's just good. We should be asking the why questions,
Mhm.
the why and what. But
Very good. A good point to bring up.
with the millennials, my ladies, I try to have discussions. I don't know how you do it. I try to have discussions, and I'll get one like really quick, short. Well, that was the right answer. Or they give a verse like that I'm going to go to next, and they explain that. So I'm like, okay, that was 5 minutes. So it's just it's such a different dynamic in all these different groups. I don't know how you have it in the teams, but
It's totally different. Totally different.
they don't either respond a lot, or if they do, it's like they'll jump ahead to, well, I know that, and it's like, oh shoot, that's my next point.
And I would say,
Yeah.
hold that thought. Hold that thought. We're going to go there. And then I want you to share that. Okay.
Yeah, it's just I'm sure, and I had a couple from the college, and this last week, so that helps some, but I'm sure his group is, because they're active, pushing the envelope, asking questions.
They do. They will respond. They're very engaged.
Yeah.
That was actually one of my favorite classes that teaches at college. I got to do that one time. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That was so much fun.
They're not inhibited. They'll take you down a rabbit trail.
They would do anything I asked them to do. I mean, we did skits, we did plays. They made up their own skits. Oh my gosh, they were just incredible.
Yeah. I cannot even see mine doing that. So.
Yeah. No, I don't try that with it.
Yeah.
Those skits with the adults class. I tried that the first time I taught, and it fell flat. So.
Yeah.
Have any of you had, maybe yourself or your parents or family members, that have had to leave a church? Not because, but because of there was heresy that was starting to be taught. Have you guys experienced that?
Never experienced that. My family, fortunately,
That's great.
we had ups and downs.
Yeah.
Within the confines, but this was a solid church from a doctrinal standpoint. Yeah.
Great.
We never had to worry about we've got to leave because get the wrong influence or the wrong message or whatever. Never
Well, I
had.
got somebody in my class.
We did.
Oh, did you?
We did, and that was where Brad started questioning stuff. And it would be a church that in normal circumstances you would look at and go, no, there. But it was there. That was there in different tenets. And if you weren't paying attention, you realize this is a philosophy that is contrary to Scripture. And you may be a direct, but it's there. And that type of philosophy was there. And we felt like we couldn't be a part of it.
Yeah.
So we did. I mean, it's a hard decision. But when your child, like I said, your teenager's coming home going, that's not right. This is wrong. This doesn't line up with,
That's good.
then you have to stop and think about it. You know, it doesn't. And that's why I said I think you get numb to it sometimes too, because you just, you know, I've heard that message before, or I'm in a safe environment of sort. You know, this is a church that has all this credentials behind it, so it's fine. And they're associated with, and they're fine.
Yes. Well, in some circles, if you get a Baptist on your nameplate,
Right.
then I know that no, not necessarily.
Yeah. But if they're twisting the gospel in any way, or they're adding to or taking away, I mean, you do have to pause. Like,
and
where
to your
is
point,
that?
they're very subtle
Mhm.
things that they bring into that mix. And
I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is when heresy does come, as a general rule, it's not a 90-degree turn.
no,
I don't think it is.
You know what I'm
I
saying?
think I think it's subtle, and I think that it may not fully go that direction, but I think if you even start to sense, and a person is unwilling, the leadership is unwilling to see that, and they're like, nope, this is still, then you have to make a decision. Like,
Well, and that's why it's so hard when we hear the terms false gospel and gospel. Sometimes we have the idea that it is black and it is white.
good point.
And it's not. And that's the danger of it. And that's why every book by Philemon, you know, there is such a major emphasis on the purity, because reality is, I mean, we'd all love it to be so easy, you know, black, white, good, bad, you know, we love to have pigeonholes in it, but life isn't that way. And, you know, when I'm teaching the youth, there's a naivety of, well, they say Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Good. But do you understand what the Mormons mean when they say this term? Do you know what they mean when and so people like, you know, Sherman from Killian Hill Christian School and Joe in the youth group, those are important things for our young people and our adults and everybody to understand that it's not this, as a general rule, it's not this hard left that all of a sudden, whoa, where did that come from? It's this slow, methodical, it's the frog in the frying pan thing where it's sometimes very difficult, and it's really hard because different people will perceive it maybe at different times. I mean, my grandparents grew up in a small town, Bern, Indiana, 3,000 people in the town. So they went to the Mennonite church. Well, if your town is 3,000, and the Mennonite church probably had 800 people in the church, it was the church. I mean, it was. My grandfather was very, very well known and things like that, but they started teaching a false gospel. I don't know if they started to teach it or if my grandfather started to recognize the error. And they finally made the choice and decision to pull out of the Mennonite church and go to another Bible church that was in town, much smaller, 7,500, not certainly the prominent church. And you want to talk about ostracizing and things like that, where you go to the bank and all of a sudden that elder that you were serving with the Mennonite won't even talk to you. So we get this, I mean, and you may have to drink that change, but maybe it wasn't that kind of a ripping apart. Everybody has a little different way of doing it. But when he's talking about these Galatian believers, be careful, because it is so easy.
Well, it is, to even our point of, you know, prejudices or you know, how we talked about the first place, when we start adding the second layer of standards and guidelines and this and that, and we say it's not attached to salvation, but we preach it more than we preach the gospel of salvation as priority. And that becomes, I think, where people they kind of dumb down to, okay, this is important. I'm focused on this and not the true gospel.
And that was what I was going to make it. Sometimes I think it's that we stop preaching. It's not that we've moved over here, but we start backing off of this for fear that we're going to offend. And it just opens the door because you create a vacuum or a void that something's got to fill it. So you start filling it. I think I shared this once before. I had a great conversation at work one time with a Catholic, and he wanted to meet, we wanted to talk. I'm fine. We started talking, but he made the point that as a fundamental Christian, we stress works more than he did as a Catholic.
That's
To your
interesting.
point, because we have all these things
Yeah.
that he sees,
Wow.
he hears as being more prominent a message
Right.
than the truth of the gospel itself.
And they see it.
And they see it
Because-
and they feel like, well, that's what they believe. These are the things, these are the tenets. And there we go. We've created a false gospel because we've created it around man-made rules as opposed to, no, let's strip all that away. And what is really the gospel? That's again, you're right. We tend to emphasize the minor as opposed to the major. And again, I think that's what Paul is saying here. Let's stay with the major. The major is
Well,
the
and
finished work of Christ on
loved-
the cross.
I saw an illustration, Matt Chandler was doing one on the Galatians, and he was talking about when he had brain surgery and how, the X-ray machine, the MRI that he had, it revealed the cancer, but it could not cure the cancer. And the law reveals the sin, but it is not the salvation or the healing of that. And, to the point that, they were incorporating, the law, it wasn't like the law, that circumcision, that suddenly now that was, no, that wasn't part of it. It's just that became central to healing and to providing salvation and grace. And it could never do that. And so it just kind of back and forth about how we kind of take that even nowadays and we present our guidelines or the pastor said, or the deacon said, or whatever it is. And we fixate on that. And that's why I said it's so subtle, even in the church that we've been in, where that became the overriding thing. Like the basis of your, salvation and the basis of your credibility was based on the fact of if you were attending certain activities that the church even had, like I remember hearing a sermon, you want to raise a fool. This is how you raise a fool, dads. You go to the soccer game with your kid on Saturday instead of attending men's prayer breakfast. That becomes a blatant statement then to a child that my dad's trying to raise a fool because that's his priority. And that becomes the gospel to him. That becomes the gospel. And that's the basis of the scripture. And it really isn't. And things like that, they start getting woven into that. And that's where you can easily become led astray, I think, by. So I don't know. There's a lot of different things you can go with this, but it's a pretty strong.
And if you start down that path with this discussion, be careful because you can go a long way with it. And wait a minute, let's reel it back in here. One more, and then we're going to go. We've got to move on and make sure that we cover these points. Great discussion, though. Great discussion.
I know some of my ladies or a couple weeks ago were talking about, music or pants or something like that. And I was like, oh man, I don't want to go. I mean, that is part of how we consider everything, but I was like, I do not want to go all the way out into that field. I want to keep it like right here. So try to keep them focused without their own thought of what that is. So.
Well, think about it. Think about how you want to ask it and how you want to control it, because sometimes you need the best laid plans of mice and men. We get off the weeds and never able to get back. So,
well, the best laid plans is they interact, and
yes.
it takes up
No,
time.
Don't think of it that way.
But no, I mean, it's nice when they're like, oh, that question went well, and it's worse when you're like, oh, that was supposed to take a little bit longer than 5 seconds. So if all else fails, send it down to Roush Classroom.
So how do I rephrase the question to get what
Exactly,
I want?
I know.
Or okay, fine. I'm just going to move on. That's why I say you need one question isn't going to do it. You need to plan at least a couple of, because we only have 45 minutes. We do have to teach a lesson, but it shouldn't be all about me and about what I have to say.
And for this, that shows the value of the true gospel.
Yes.
Because how do you know? Well, it's just like counterfeit. How do you know when you're dealing with counterfeit?
Yeah.
You know it more so by knowing what the real is like. than by studying the
Mhm.
tendencies of the
Mhm.
faith. I mean, there might be some things you would obviously notice, but you know the real so well,
That's
and
what
it's
we should do.
constantly rehearsed.
You should bring counterfeit money and real
No,
money and
no.
go, how do you,
I don't even
and tell
want to be
your
by where I
teams,
would find it.
how do you
It's like
know?
Monopoly
But if
money.
you had money, how do you know which one's real? How do you discern real?
I'll talk to
Just run
Ryan
through-
Timms, but
yeah.
hey
Maybe
Ryan,
get
you
some-
got any? You got a stash somewhere?
Just
Is it-
photocopy it, Bill.
Mm.
Make
Oh,
it
okay,
size
Wes.
and-
Yeah.
Do you know, you seem like you're an expert
No,
on
man,
this.
but you know the difference between.
Holding it,
You
there's,
hold it up there.
hold it to
because
the light and
all the other things, but.
you hold it up to the light.
Well, to
Okay,
add
you can
to
do
what you were
that.
just saying as far as a counterfeit, I think that our gullibility comes with our lack of knowledge as well.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes,
Exactly right.
very
Right?
definitely.
'Cause- so, I might start with the conclusion question.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah,
see
no,
that.
but yeah.
As long as you come full circle.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
that
And-
then
and-
gives
and-
it a reason then why you, that then springboards then
Yeah,
why it's
absolutely.
important.
Right, and then I just come full circle right
Comes
back to
right
this. It's important that we understand and that we know,
Exactly.
so that we're
And
not
these-
gullible,
right,
so that
these right
we
into-
recognize everyone we see.
right, instead of just kind of coming in and saying, well, let's define the gospel, it's about, we start with this.
Fine,
Let's do this, and then we can say, so.
that's why I said, whether you start with, let's define and just have a general discussion, I like that though.
Do you just have your aha moment?
Hmm, yeah.
Do you just have your aha
No,
moment?
that's just a start.
So how are
It's a
you
good
gonna,
start.
how are you gonna start with the gullibility one? Are you gonna do
I'm not really sure. I won't do that yet. But just when we were going over it and listening, I'm like,
Mhm.
for me,
That's a strong statement.
that's a springboard comment
comment.
right there,
That's fine.
which kind of leads into what we or follows up what we did last week with, because I pretty much ended well, you were there. I pretty much ended my lesson with, why was, Paul so angry about this? Why was he so passionate about it as well?
Yeah.
Because we did our lesson based, I asked people to give an explanation of what they do and what their expertise and what their knowledge is, and try to get them to kind of personalize, like, so when somebody challenges what you know is true, how do you respond to that? And so we'll see what we can
Okay,
pull together. But I might just throw that, that gullible thing. I might just like,
no problem with that, no problem with that. The thing about introduction and conclusion, especially conclusion is supposed to be the summarization, if you please, the whole thing. So if you start there, as long as you come back there, I'm opening with a question, but I'm coming back at the end with a statement.
yeah, I mean, I don't expect them to define it at the
No.
beginning. I want to throw that out there. I'm gonna say,
Yeah.
okay, we're gonna move to this.
Yeah.
And then we
There's
come
a
back
reason-
to this question.
There's a reason why I'm putting it out there to start. The lesson will pretty much tell you why. And then I want to reemphasize the fact, we need to be knowledgeable. Okay? Need to be more than a monitor. I love that commercial. I'm just a monitor. I just tell you there's a problem. I'm not here to fix it.
Oh,
It's
the bank
That's a
robber.
the bank
Yeah, I
robber.
saw that one too.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh,
not
wait,
actually
I
a
did
security
see
guard.
You're
that.
being
Yeah.
robbed. Yeah,
Security
I
consultant.
don't know anything about it.
Tell you
I'm
that it's
just telling you it's
happening.
happening.
I'm just here to let you know that it's happening.
That's right, I did see that.
I'm
Just a glimpse of it.
Yeah. Well, same thing, It's more than just
Mhm.
monitoring. We need to know the truth. And we need to be able to oppose error. That's the whole point. Hey, good stuff. Any other questions?
I don't think so. Greg, you
Okay,
know what you're doing?
I think I do.
good.
I'm considering a texting group discussion.
A texting group discussion.
Ooh, listen to this. You leverage what he can.
And I'm trying to think about, I need to, haven't, but dividing them in 3 groups and say in 2 texts, you're going to text it to me, each group. Text to me in 2 texts, that's 280 characters or whatever it is, I think. The gospel. It has to be summarized in there.
So they come up as a group.
They're going to come up with what are some
Keywords, key phrases.
Think of some keywords, some key phrases. Gospel contains this and this and this. And let's
Great.
just see what we come up with.
Okay.
Mhm.
Good.
And start getting up. What is it? So it's sort of a fireworks
Sure.
type deal, and say,
Sure.
okay,
Sure.
here's what I got. Now, why is this important? You're working at Chick-fil-A. and you've got a coworker, and you've got another coworker, and you start talking about Jesus Christ,
Mhm.
do you think what you need to know about Jesus Christ, based upon the Bible, is going to be pretty important?
Oh,
Hmm.
I remember moving, because I was from the north
I-
and coming down, but I'm saying coming down to the south.
No, yeah.
And people would be like, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm like, this is crazy. There are so many, and then you start realizing, somebody said, one of my bosses said to me, we're all Christians down here. And the reality of that really hit, like, they may claim that name, but they don't hold
It's
to
woven
what
a little
it is or
differently
what
in the
isn't.
fabric
Yeah.
of culture here in the
Yeah.
South. I don't mean that badly at
Yeah,
all.
no.
I lived in the South for 10 years, but it is a different part of the fabric, just like the Northeast has a different
Yes.
kind of religion in their
Yeah.
fabric.
Catholicism is very strong.
Very
Yeah.
much so. And,
Mhm.
so that's not a bad thing, but you have to, as you're dealing with purity of the gospel, you got to know that
Mhm.
what you're saying, what you
Mhm.
believe, and then you've got to be discerning as you hear,
Yeah.
not critical, but discerning and saying lovingly,
Yeah.
this is what the Bible says.
Mhm.
So,
What came to mind was I heard this morning on the news about this, now there's this Dutch guy that's running for prime minister.
Huh.
for Canada or?
No, in
Oh,
the
in
Netherlands.
Netherlands,
okay.
area, anyway, who, his thing is, he's doing the same thing Trump did here. He's doing this, this populist nationalist type
Okay.
thing. Everything's good. But the comment is, he wants to ban Muslims and Moroccans. I don't understand the Moroccan one, but
That's interesting.
and so that we can be a white Christian
A white
country
Christian.
again. White Christian. But the interesting thing is that their version of white Christian is so that they can preserve their liberal
Mhm.
values
That's
of, LGBT, get to have our drugs and our brothels and stuff like that, because these Muslims are coming in and making it
No way.
to where we can't
Yeah.
do this.
Right.
Wow.
And I was thinking like, wait. This started with the term white Christian, and this is their
Yeah.
definition.
Yeah.
We talk about a false.
But see, that's what the world hears, and then
Yeah.
they hear that you're a Christian.
Yeah.
And that package, depending on that
Yeah.
person,
And you're
means
white.
all different kinds of things.
Right. Well, and here in America, Christian and conservative, being a conservative, is supposed to be synonymous,
Mhm.
right? And so I
Well,
always.
Yeah.
Well, I did think it was interesting that lady, that Jewish teacher, though, her whole, going back to that, the whole concept of, they just kind of coexist together. They're both good options, an option for the Gentiles and options for the Jews. But there's not one is better than the other. And
Yeah.
and when
I
you
get
to the
that. I
heart
get
of
that from my
you
mother.
go,
I get that from my mom.
like, let's
Mom,
all
you
live
are
in,
so
let's all live
far
in,
off.
let's, have monotheism
Really?
and all live in peace.
Oh yeah, my mom believes that everything leads to the same path.
Okay.
I said, Mom, it does not.
Yeah.
So, it's just
That's
tough.
interesting.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Bill, you got a couple of minutes?
Thank you.
I got nothing but time.
Dang.
No.
Thanks, Tom.